Now, a couple of days ago, DeSean Jackson was on I Am Athlete. And for those of you guys who don't know what I Am Athlete is, it's a podcast that is hosted by Brandon Marshall. It's a very good podcast, one of the best podcasts out there, one of my favorite to listen to. If you haven't listened to it, go ahead and check it out. And basically, DeSean Jackson was on there. They were talking about his NFL career, what's next for him, life after football. And they also asked him to kind of reflect on his career in a sense. And is he a Hall of Famer? And does he feel as if he's the greatest deep threat in NFL history? And of course, DeSean Jackson said yes. Now, of course, a couple of people pushed back on this. Some people said, Randy Moss, you really feel you was better than Randy Moss, D-Jax? And he said yes. Now, I understand where DeSean Jackson is coming from. Because you got to remember, this question wasn't who was the better wide receiver, because we know who the better wide receiver was. It was Randy Moss. The question was who was the better deep threat, D-Jax or Randy Moss? And it's two ways that you can look at this argument. Okay, obviously you can go off the physical attributes, and then you have the statistics. Now, physically, you're going to go with Randy Moss, and so am I. Randy Moss, 6'4", 210 pounds, versus DeSean Jackson, was 5'9", 5'10", 170 pounds, maybe 180-something pounds at best. So, of course, we're going to go with Randy Moss. Randy Moss not only could beat you with his ability to dominate you one-on-one and win those 50-50 matchups downfield, but he also could blow past you with his speed. But for DeSean Jackson, however, he wasn't as physically dominant as Randy Moss was. He had to do more with less in a sense. And really what made DeSean Jackson such a elite deep threat was his speed. So for DeSean Jackson, his argument was that, you know, Randy Moss, great and all, he could catch those jump balls, he could moss you, he could blow past you, but for me, I only could rely on pretty much my speed. So pretty much DeSean Jackson was saying that he did more with less. And I understand that. The person who can make the most without being as gifted as others tends to be regarded as better in a sense. Because imagine if DeSean Jackson was 6'4", 210 pounds with his elite speed. The argument probably could be a little bit different. But if you're going to ask on somebody, okay, you have Randy Moss, DeSean Jackson, who you throwing a 50-yard bomb to, you're going with Randy Moss. But if we're going off statistics, I think DeSean Jackson has a very good argument for why he can be considered not only a better deep threat than Randy Moss, but the best deep threat in NFL history. Now, of course, many of you guys are going to say, JT, what about Jerry Rice? You're going to name other good deep threats as well. But if we're really going off the numbers, DeSean Jackson has a really good case for why he can consider himself the greatest deep threat in NFL history. Think about this. DeSean Jackson averaged 17.6 yards per reception in his career. Jerry Rice averaged 15.6. DeSean Jackson also led the NFL in yards per reception multiple times throughout his career. 2010, 22.5 yards per reception, led the NFL. 2014, 20.9. 2016, 17.9. And 2018, 18.9. DeSean Jackson is also number one in the NFL in all time in catches, yards, and touchdowns on throws of 20-plus yards or more. He also has the most 60-yard touchdowns in NFL history with 24. He's also second in NFL history in most 50-yard touchdowns. When you compare that to Jerry Rice, however, he's second in the NFL all-time in receiving touchdowns of 40-plus yards or more. The only wide receiver who has more than him is Jerry Rice with 54. And then you have Terrell Owens behind him. But if you're looking at who was the overall better deep threat statistically, I think that DeSean Jackson has a really strong case for the claim of being the best deep threat in NFL history. And of course, some people are going to say Tyreek Hill and whatnot, but I feel Tyreek Hill was pretty good after the catch. I still would take, well, I don't know. It really depends. But me personally, I think DeSean Jackson's claims of being the greatest deep threat of all time isn't something to be scuffed at. Because, of course, when he said this, I went immediately down to the comment section. I paused that episode of the podcast. And I just wanted to see what people's thoughts on about those comments. And a lot of people said DeSean Jackson was tripping. He wasn't better than Randy Moss. But I don't really think too many people were trying to hear out DeSean Jackson's case. He wasn't saying that he was a better receiver than Randy Moss. He was saying that he was just a better deep threat. And the numbers kind of back that up. But as I mentioned earlier, it's two sides to this argument. Are you going to go with who you would prefer to throw the deep ball to physically, by physical traits? Because if not, we're going with Randy Moss. Randy Moss, bigger, was pretty fast his own right. Maybe not as fast as DeSean Jackson in the game speed, but Randy Moss could move for his size. And on top of that, he'd also dominate you physically. DeSean Jackson really could just kill you with speed. However, if we're going by the numbers show that DeSean Jackson was a better deep threat than Randy Moss. And you can disagree with that all you want to, but the numbers are the numbers. And I'm not saying that I would take Randy Moss over DeSean Jackson. I'm just saying that based off the statistics, DeSean Jackson's claims aren't as crazy as how some people were making it out to be. But you guys let me know who you guys think was the better deep threat, DeSean Jackson or Randy Moss. We already know physically it was Randy Moss, okay? However, based off the stats, DeSean Jackson has a really good claim for that title.